Greetings, friends. I've been reading this book, Wealth and Democracy, A Political History of the American Rich by Kevin Phillips. This book came out, I think, 2001, so it's not that recent, but with history books, that's not always so important. 2002, it came out, and it chronicles how wealth was distributed across various segments of the American population. I haven't read the whole book. I've read, sections of it here and there because honestly, it could be a better book. A lot of the tables and breakdown of data, he goes in length, at depth. And I just find myself asking, why is this important? Why do I need to know such specific information about how, over a 50-year time span, the distribution of wealth in the top 5% of the population tripled, what am I trying to say? The relative, the middle class grew by 25% in 70 years, and just all these little minutiae of detail. But however, there are chapters where he does talk about some interesting stuff. When he's giving an overall, when he's condensing a lot of the more, condensing it into more of a concise, meaningful overview. So he actually talks not just about the U.S., but which already 20 years ago was clear that the American empire was falling. So this is something that's been it's kind of the theme of the book, the rise and the fall, and often it's the decadent phase that's explored in most detail. And what are the signs of when do you identify the golden age? When do you identify the good old days? When do you identify, how long does the collapse take to fulfill itself? It takes decades. It takes several generations. When does it actually start to collapse, and when does it become apparent to the general population? Those two events could be separated by 50 to 70 years, depending on circumstances. He mentions in some detail what happened, the previous empires, not all empires. He doesn't talk about France, Russia, but he talks about Spain as an economic power, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. I'll probably come back to this book later to talk about, also he talks about the Netherlands. I'll have to deal with that separately. And then the British Empire. And then, of course, the American Empire, at least in financial terms, in economic terms, the rise of these powers and the collapse of them. So we're just going to look at Spain, or what he calls Greater Spain, in this video, where Spanish power, how quickly it rose, and how it all came undone. So this is from the chapter, The World is Our Oyster. Greater Spain became the world's most important political and economic force by the 1540s and the 1550s. He says earlier that it basically began to rise in the 1520s, and this coincided with their colonization of the New World. Hispaniola, Mexico, and then later Peru. Shipments of gold and silver from the New World, only a trickle in the decades following Columbus's explorations, now arrived on a large enough scale to help bring on what scholars have called the 16th century price revolution. Dynastic upheaval also extended Spain's reach. Ferdinand and Isabella had ruled Castile and Aragon. Their Habsburg son-in-law, Charles V, by 1520, would not just be King of Spain, but ruler of Austria, southern Italy, Burgundy, and Flanders, as well as the elected Holy Roman Emperor. Imperial economics gained sophistication in the late 1550s as the Spanish crown, already sovereign over Antwerp and the Low Countries, allied itself with the merchant bankers of the rich maritime republic of Genoa. Besides the Flemings and Augsburgers, the Habsburgs ruling in Madrid had now enlisted another financial elite with an influential network across Europe. After these convergences Greater Spain was not displaced as Europe's leading power until the drain of the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 and the full-fledged emergence of an independent Holland, which we'll discuss in another video. He mentions that there was an immense flow of silver and gold coming from the New World to Spain, especially between the 1530s when it began to the 1580s, after new techniques had further increased New World silver output, bringing what Spaniards called the largueza, the abundance of money. Besides restoring national confidence, shaken by periodic royal bankruptcies, the largueza also underwrote the ill-fated Armada against England. Commercial and manufacturing towns like Toledo, Segovia, and Burgos grew through the 1570s or 1580s. Seville, principal base of the American trade, increased its population from 70,000 in 1530 to about 150,000 in 1588, the Armada year. A turning point is often found in 1596, when yet another royal bankruptcy from overspending produced a wave of national pessimism. The annual flow of bullion from the Americas, while close to its fabulous peak, was no longer much of a barometer by 1600. I guess he means a barometer for how well the Spanish economy was doing, how well the society was doing. Successive kings had mortgaged future treasure shipments to finance their imperial ambitions. Nuggets from Peru and Mexico paid for siege guns. These nuggets also paid for musketeers on the Rhine River and paid for far too many of these military components, given how 2/3 of Spain's revenues went to service debt. Even so, the cascade of precious metal, and he mentions that New World production merely enlarged Europe's gold coin and plate by 20%, but it tripled its silver trove. So a lot more silver coming in than gold is what he's saying. In the words of one 17th century Spaniard, the possession and abundance of such wealth altered everything. Agriculture laid down the plow. Trade put on a noble air, and exchanging the workbench for the saddle, went out to parade up and down the street. The arts disdained mechanical tools. So let me just say that, you see, the sacred or the special nature of nobility is being undermined in this prelude to the Enlightenment. We've discussed how the English in the 1600s were already undermining royal authority. Now we see how commercial pursuits are undermining, or not, well, they're undermining by taking on this noble air, expanding. You can now buy your nobility. So it cheapens the office or the position of the nobility. He continues, the lure of easy money undermined what modern observers would call Spain's real economy. The kingdom of Ferdinand and Isabella had a successful wool-growing industry in Castile, as well as two established commercial centers, Burgos and Medina del Campo, and several known for manufactures, Segovia with textiles and Toledo with textiles and steel. By the 1580s, their mid-century growth reversed as Spaniards left the hitherto more prosperous north for Madrid, the new capital, and Seville. The textile industry, middling in size but Spain's largest, peaked in the 1570s and then lost markets. When it was unable to meet New World demand, other sources had to be found. The bullion inflow in the meantime had so inflated Spanish wages and prices that foreign imports, which were cheaper and often better, undercut much of Spain's own domestic production. So I found that interesting, that get all this wealth coming in, it raises wages, and then you end up wanting to buy foreign imports because your own prices for the same goods are higher because everything has gone up in price, I guess, because the wages have inflated. Spain's incessant borrowing led to an elaborate infrastructure of debt instruments and arrangements, as well as a horde of domestic and foreign bankers. Their most Catholic majesties, the rulers of 16th century Spain, took their revenues and funds from taxes, banker loans, and issuance of credit bonds. Peasants, artisans, and merchants paid most of the taxes because hidalgos, or gentlemen, were exempted by law. In addition to borrowing from bankers, who were mostly Genoese, the crown also issued credit bonds called juros, typically paying 5 to 7%, but sometimes as much as 12 to 14%, depending on the revenue source specified. Originated in the 15th century war against the Moors in Granada, the later juros issued by Charles V and Philip II were bought by merchants, hidalgos, and grandes, or indeed by any Spaniard with money. The result, according to a leading historian, was the growth of a powerful rentier class in Castile, investing its money not in trade or industry but in annuities. Merchants and successful artisans particularly felt the squeeze. As rising taxes destroyed Castilian enterprise, their burden and the circumventions available induced wealthy merchants and businessmen to abandon their businesses and buy privileges of hidalguía, or that gentlemanly status, purchasing that in order to escape the burden of taxation. One economic commentator of the time, known as González de Seorrigo, argued that money is not true wealth. The latter, with true wealth, only coming from increased agricultural and manufacturing production rather than from precious metals. Spanish wealth was being dissipated on thin air, on papers, contracts, censos, and letters of exchange, on cash and silver and gold, instead of being expended on things that yield profits and attract riches from outside to augment the riches within. As discontent grew, the Spanish government of the 1620s proposed banking reforms, a 5% interest rate cap, prohibitions on the import of on foreign manufactures, curbs on extravagant dress. And this is the 16th century, I'd add, so I was reading about the same thing in Tudor England. There wasn't a huge government bureaucracy. Government was fairly small, but it could be extremely draconian, and it could issue laws about every unimaginable aspects of your. Well, we're seeing that today. Unfortunately, we're seeing that come back today. Only today we have the nightmarish bureaucracy and machine to back them up. But back then, it was just simple stuff like you can't even wear certain things. Meanwhile, the 30 Years' War drained Spanish coffers. The gold and silver arriving in Seville in 1625 was only half of what had come in 1600. Maritime trade passed to other nations, and by the mid-1600s, the tonnage of merchant shipping between Spain and the Americas had shrunk by 2/3. By the early 17th century, as decline became irrefutable, cities like Burgos and Toledo contained only half their population of 1561. People went back to the countryside in a refeudalization akin to that of Italy. I guess he means Italy following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when people left the cities because there was no food anymore and they had to go back to live for some lord in the countryside. He says that in Spain, following this decline, which was apparent certainly by 1625, it would have been so that's sort of the time he's talking about where seigneurial agriculture grew again, with many lords the richer for owning large holdings of government bonds. By 1650, Spain's historical sun at least had set. So what lessons can we draw from this? We can draw the lesson that an influx of money is not always a good thing, especially if it's an unimaginable sum of money, and it seems to have no clear limit on, it probably will over time, but the amount of precious metals coming into Spain was unprecedented, and it led to inflation because all of the silver coming in. Of course, the value of the silver is not going to remain the same if you just flood it all into Spain, and that had a bit of an effect. They tried to keep a lot of it in Spain, but inevitably that would filter out into other parts of Europe. So as we saw, it raised wages. It's going to create a destabilizing effect. Now, I don't think that money in itself, if managed well, is necessarily going to lead to decline, but you don't want to probably base your nation on money. This is something that we'll see later when we discuss the Dutch and the English and how they became more aware of the problems with basing everything on the financial interests. And we see it's not necessarily such a recent thing to have a country creating debt instruments and all this abstract terminology. It's been going on for hundreds of years with all this money and the obligations that the Spanish took on, all these debt obligations that they're taking on as they have this unprecedented amount of wealth coming in. Well, I mean, whether it's real wealth or not. Certainly money power coming in and attracting some of the other classes, certain other international people. They come to some of these more open international cities. The financial class grows, and what you see is after the golden age or after the good old days, whenever it is, you get more financial polarization. You get lots of poor people, and the middling classes, they shrink, and you have a small number of elite. Sounds familiar, like our current days, but that pattern reasserts itself. So the Spanish they could have maybe preserved their empire, but it didn't last more than really 100 years. I mean, their empire lasted, but their primacy, that Spain was the dominant power and God favored Spain, that didn't last more than really 100 years. By the way, I'll just conclude with one factoid that I learned when I was in a geography course way back in university. And it makes sense. I mean, I guess, you can't trust everything you learn in university, but the professor was saying that one of the reasons the Spanish were first they'd just been concluding defeating the Moors at the same time. That's another context. So they're on their A game because they're finally reconquesting the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims almost completely by this time. And not even 200 years before, it was like an entirely different picture. So all of the, Spain itself had been recently reconquered. And then so the military is in a good state. That's good for expanding. I mean, they're riding the same exploration wave that the Portuguese had been doing, exploring the world. But that's a whole other story. But one thing that a lot of people might not know is that Spain, because it's geographically more similar to North Africa, most of the land, a lot more scrubland, low quality land that you can't use for agriculture. So you do pastoral stuff and you raise cattle and stuff. So that's sort of Spanish cattle rearing. And why do they have that culture of like the bull runs and herding cattle and the cowboy culture? That was environmentally and culturally already developed very well in Spain, and then they were able to adapt very well in the New World in places like the Southwest and what is now Mexico, and all that culture was already was at the height of their game. So yeah, I mean, even in Queen Elizabeth's time in 1588, when Spain was flushed with wealth and they had a huge armada to go and attack England, and very well could have invaded England, but it didn't turn out that way for reasons of luck and maybe God and reasons of weather. It's a very, the English Channel is very finicky. But it just shows the confidence that would have existed in Spain at the time, that they would be able to do this. Hasta luego, amigos.